Hi, everyone. I'm Edgar. We will get started in just a few seconds. I see that folks are coming into the room. Want to welcome everyone to our session today. We'll get started in just another minute. All right, let's jump in. Hi, everyone. My name is Edgar Villanueva. I am speaking with you today from Brooklyn, New York. This is the traditional unceded territory of the Lenape tribe. And I'm just so honored to be with you all today. All are welcome here. I serve as the Senior Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation. I'm an author and the founder of Decolonizing Wealth Project. I want to thank the Schott Foundation and the Nellie Mae Education Foundation for being co-sponsors of today's event. In 2018, which seems like a lifetime ago, right? I moderated the first conversation on Philanthropy So White, giving a clear, urgent call to philanthropy that it or we must fundamentally change our ivory tower culture, what it accepts as acceptable behavior, who it esteems as experts, how it defines success or worthiness in funding and in leadership in order to really walk its talk about equity, to really embody our name, love of humanity. Since 2018, Decolonizing Wealth has ignited an era of reckoning in our sector with calls to decolonize, redistribute, and reparations. And the world itself has flipped on its axis. First, we survived the reign of a white supremacy terrorist in our administration in the US and promotion of white supremacy ideology from that administration that will take us generations to recover from. And then there's COVID-19, the deadly virus that has swept the globe and upended millions of lives, especially in the US because of the government's negligent and dangerous response. There's the economic fallout from the pandemic, with millions of jobs lost, lines at food banks growing, and small businesses around the country shuttered for good, disproportionately those in communities of color. And in the middle of all of this, while the number of cases was growing by the day and the death toll rising, we saw the horrific murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department that fueled a global movement to declare that Black Lives Matter. And finally, an arguably more devastating crisis is the pandemic of white supremacy that has infected our society so deeply across every sector, and yes, even ours, philanthropy. For Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color, white supremacy has been the pre-existing condition that has exacerbated every other pain. And sadly, we philanthropy have a long way to go in our sector to live out our values of equity, even to achieve parity. The face of philanthropy, the funding, and the system hasn't changed much. The stats speak for themselves. 90% of foundation CEOs are white. 85% of foundation boards are white, while no more than 10% of foundation funding goes specifically to people of color. We have a lot of work to do. Up until now, diversity and inclusion tactics have been about getting different kinds of people in the door and then asking them to assimilate to dominant white culture. The issue is not recruitment of diverse humans, the pipeline focus of the past, getting people in the door, providing a seat at the table, as it is often said. The issue is creating a culture of respect, curiosity, acceptance, and love. It's about building a whole new table. But there is a window and an opportunity before us. So today, here we are again with an impressive audience of over 6,000 of you, where we will explore the unique journeys of three white philanthropic leaders who are striving towards racial equity. My guests will talk about when they first got woke, when they considered their role as white leaders, what they consider their role as white leaders in philanthropy to be, how they have dealt with mistakes and criticism along the way, where they go for resources and support in their personal journeys, and how they hold themselves accountable to communities of color, and much more, as much as I can squeeze into this hour. For way too long, the work of social justice or racial justice in philanthropy has been championed by Black, Indigenous, and people of color folks for good reason. But today I'm sharing the mic. This is an opportunity for white leaders to speak to other white leaders and to collect their people in ways that only they can and must do. I am hopeful and inspired by their leadership, and I appreciate their willingness to speak up and to speak out in this space. After our conversation, my dear friend and colleague, Vanessa Daniel, Executive Director of the Groundswell Fund, will provide some closing reflections and wisdom, bringing accountability and perspective to this conversation. So before we dive in, I do want to invite all of you to participate on social media. We are live streaming this conversation right now on YouTube from the Decolonizing Wealth Project page. If you have any problems with Zoom, please go to YouTube to watch there. We are busting the seams of our capacity on Zoom, so we wanted to let you know that the conversation is there as well. And also, we'll be watching social media. We want to keep this conversation going using the hashtags Decolonizing Wealth and hashtag Philanthropy So White. So please feel free to tweet and to share what you're learning from this conversation or questions that you might have on social media. Now, I'm excited to dive into this important conversation today. Please welcome Nick Donohue from the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, Hilary Pennington from the Ford Foundation, and John Palfrey from the Macarthur Foundation. Hi, everybody.
Hey there. Hey, Edgar.
Thanks for being here. So good to see you. To get us started, we all know who you are from your institutional, positional leadership. I want to get personal with you today. Would each of you share just a little bit about who you are? And as people say in my community back home, who's your people? Who are you, and how have you as a human being come to this conversation we're having today? Nick, I'll start with you.
Great. Thank you, Edgar. Welcome, everyone. First, I want to say just appreciate being here. Edgar, yourself, Hilary, John, Trisha, who's helping to run the show, Vanessa, your voice, and special shout out to Kiara Wegener, Chief Communications Officer at the Foundation, for helping to pull us together. So when I think about the question you asked, so I identify as a white man of privilege. I'm an educator, started as a teacher, worked as a state commissioner, run an education philanthropy for the past 14 years. Organizational leader is now part of my identity. My pronouns are he, him, his. I identify also as a parent. I now have adopted lately, sort of recognize myself also as an artisan of some sort. Somebody introduced me around that. So I spend time, just thinking about the visual and tactile world and making things. And do you want me to go on and talk about the awareness piece, Edgar?
Sure, yeah. Kind of what brings you to this conversation today.
Right. So we were asked, to talk about sort of what got us here. And I think my answer is, and I want to be careful about this. I mean, I watched myself a little bit on the program a year or two ago, and it was just, as embarrassing as anyone can imagine, see yourself speaking that way. But I'm proud of and recognize sort of the growth I've had and how I ended up here. And I'm very conscious of not sounding like, a finished product or like I have this all figured out. But this journey really started where a colleague of mine, Sonia Kaus-Gleason, dropped an article on my desk at the foundation, which was Paying Attention to White Culture and Privilege, a Missing Link in Advancing Racial Equity. And it was a tome about philanthropy written by Gita Gulati-Partee and Maggie Potupchak, who ended up helping us on this journey. So that was an eye-opener for me. I'd been a long, active, progressive, white person, liberal person working on issues. I was working on backing leaders of color and trying to, get behind people. But I'll admit that up until 2016, I hadn't really thought about whiteness and the role and the power of it. I hadn't thought about white being classified as a race, actually. For me, it was still the neutral color. Whiteness and race is a white construct to secure white supremacy. I understand that now. But it really was this opening up of whiteness that was a big piece, because it gave me something to be responsible for that was mine and ours as white people. We need help thinking about it with people of color, but that's our business to unpack and deconstruct that. Read Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. That was super informative. The Color of Law, getting a history lesson in this was big, because I think for different reasons, white people, myself, we feel bad, but we also are so entitled. We think it's all about us. And guess what? This is a long history of oppression that, fortunately, it didn't start with me, but it could end with me and others. So really understanding the historical context was important. And just having the relationships, the people around me. My world had diversified some intentionally, my board, my staff, and my social life, and it just made it a different conversation. Reading Edgar's book was a huge event. Understanding the BIPOC frame and the essential nature of identifying anti-Blackness and the strife and punishment of Indigenous people over time was a big step. And I've just came to see today that, it's not our money. And we need to do something different with it. So I'll pause there. The journey continues, and got a lot to learn. I'm a big ancient history fan. I guess I'm an ancient history buff too. And the message there was, the more you know, the more you know you don't know. And I feel like that every day now.
Absolutely. Yeah, I firmly believe that everything we need to know about the future, we can find in the past. So I appreciate that, Nick. John, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Edgar. And I just echo the thanks to each person here who's put this event together, and the very warm welcome to be a part of this conversation. And as uncomfortable it is to be centered in the conversation, I realize our role in the conversation as a white person of great privilege like Nick. My roots are close to where you are, Edgar, in New York City, where I was born, but then grew up in New England, child of two academic pediatricians. And I grew up in a household, where people talked a lot about doing social good, and my parents rode a bus to serve underserved communities, and I was very proud of that, of course, and excited about that as a life that people could and should lead as people with a lot of privilege and as white people. In terms of family background, I became aware at some point, I actually don't know at what point, but that members of my family had enslaved other people at a certain point and had also been abolitionists. And that's on multiple sides of my family. My family hasn't been here as long as the Lenape people or the Potawatomi here in Chicago, but hundreds of years in the US frame, and realizing that that blood, both sides of that blood or all of that blood flows through me. And as Nick said, I didn't create white supremacy, but I certainly am a product of it in a variety of ways. And the education I've had and other things that I've had, we're not a family of great wealth, but the supports that have come through that over time, are absolutely in me. I would give two little aha moment type things that you asked us to reflect on. And I don't think any of this is, becoming a finished product, as Nick said, or becoming woke and then being done. This is a long and ongoing journey in my case. But two things in my last two jobs I would note. One was my last job, I was head of school of a boarding school. I think when people look at outside of boarding schools, there's a lot of, bad history there for a variety of reasons, but there's also a lot of good and interesting things going on today. But I was early in my job, I was walking around the campus. It was a beautiful campus. And I was walking with a friend who was a Black person who was teaching there, had been teaching there for a number of years. And he said to me, John, what was your first reaction when you came to a campus like this? And I remembered back being a 12 or 13-year-old applying to go to boarding school. I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. So many opportunities. What a great thing. And he said, look, when I first, as an adult, walked onto this campus, this particular one at Andover, I was angry. I was angry because I realized that some people had this high school and I had the high school I had. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, like what a different experience walking into a, historically predominantly white and beautiful and rich institution. And he then went on to say, look, and I've stuck around because I realized the project that we're involved in is in fact to remake these institutions, to deconstruct and reconstruct these institutions. And that was extremely powerful and important thing for me to think of, devoted our time to doing that and making a much more diverse organization in Andover. But then the other aha moment I'll frame was becoming appointed 2 years ago to the Macarthur Foundation presidency. And, I prepared myself by reading Edgar's book. It was the first book I read, Decolonizing Wealth, in preparation. This is a time of excitement and trying to take the things that we've done at Andover and bring them into the work of Macarthur Foundation. And when my appointment was announced, it was met with a lot of criticism. And this was a very helpful moment for me, as much as, so set aside for a second the personal feelings of what it's like to feel unwelcome or unwanted. Much more important was saying, okay, a little like that anger reaction to Andrew, like, why are people reacting this way? I think I'm a nice person. I'm a child of academic pediatricians doing good work. And don't you care about what I did on equity and inclusion at Andover? No, point was I was a signal and a symbol of ongoing, white supremacy in the field. And I got a great job that many people thought I shouldn't get. So in realizing this reaction, that too was a sense of, okay, I have a lot of work to do. I have an opportunity here, but I also, I am a symbol of the ongoing white supremacy in the field. And to grapple with that is the rest of today's conversation. But thank you for the chance to tell a bit of that journey and to be here.
Thank you, John, for sharing that. Absolutely. Hilary, let's hear from you.
Thanks, Edgar. And just to echo gratitude for you and your leadership and for the opportunity to be here, and +1 to so much of what Nick and you had to say, John. So I'm Hilary Pennington. I identify as a white woman of privilege. My pronouns are she, her. And I grew up spending my childhood going between two places which were steeped in white supremacy and structural racism. I was born in South Africa to a South African father in Johannesburg, and I spent most of my youth growing up in St. Louis, but going back and forth between those two places. And I would say they had everything to do with why I do the kind of work that I do. And yet, it really wasn't until my time in philanthropy that I began to do the deepest internal work of really confronting my own bias, my own accountability. And I think, like for all of us on this call, figuring out like, how do I use who I am in the structures that I am in to change them? And I'll just tell one story of my time at Ford. When I started there in 2013, it was a really different place than it is today. Today our leadership team is half people of color, half women. I'm the only white woman of 6 women leaders in the foundation. But when I started, it was pretty much an all-white team, and it was pretty much an all-male team. I was one of 2 women. And I was also one of 3, the only woman in a kind of a peer group of program vice presidents. And I spent so much time and energy on myself, feeling that my voice wasn't heard. I was talked over, all the kinds of things that happen in meetings and in institutions that we experience. And yet what I came to know and what I have been working on in these years since is what an incredible amount of privilege I have. And you look at our institutions and you see, Edgar, to the point that you started with, that we are changing who we are. The who we are at every level of the institution has to change. And leaders like me have to do a much different and a much better job of owning our own privilege and using it to try to change the culture of those institutions. And I have this is a journey that requires you to do a lot of things differently. I mean, some are structural, working to change who you hire and who you promote and who you hear. And that has been an ongoing journey at Ford. And I think it also requires for people like me to unlearn lots of the things that made us successful coming up. Especially I think as a woman and a white woman, you tend to assert yourself in a meeting, you try to speak in, you'd end up taking up space from others and away from others that you need to learn how to cede. So I would say that that's a deep kind of issue in philanthropy that for all of us who are understanding in a better way intellectually where racism comes from and how we have accountability for it, it is still so challenging every day to deal with ourselves. And we have to do that. And we have to do that in really individual ways in the communities that we work in, as well as in the institutional places that we serve. And I'll stop there. I'm interested to get into the conversation with each other.
No, I so appreciate, especially that last point, Hilary. I think in our sector, we can so intellectualize, and theories, and we can get pretty heady in these conversations about equity. And I just really appreciate each of you sharing your deeply personal, moments, because, this is about personal transformation. It is work of the heart, work of the spirit, right? That will bleed out into our leadership and the work that we're doing in our institution. So thank you for sharing that. I want to move us to a conversation about sort of the messiness of this work a little bit, because, white dominant culture leads us to strive for perfectionism, and the need for perfectionism can really stall the work of racial equity in so many ways. It can create fear for us to step into that discomfort. And I think it's especially pervasive in, foundation culture. You can ask any program officer who's helped to assemble a board book about, how that's like, just one example that comes to mind. So I would love for you all to speak for just a minute about the edges of this work. That how is it for you as a white person? What have you had to work through to become a co-conspirator in dismantling white supremacy? Tell us a little bit about the messiness of this work and how you're pushing through that to learn and grow. How about Hilary? Do you mind starting? We'll go the other way around.
No, that's the key question, Edgar. And I think, for me, it is mostly around my role in the structures of philanthropy. So let's just take the two basic things we do: develop strategies and make grants, right? So when I came to Ford in 2013, I was tasked with leading our strategy development process, and I made every imperialistic mistake in the book. We hired external consultants. We privileged the analytics that the external consultants do and particularly external consultants from the global north, over really listening deeply to communities from the global south. And when we made the decision to focus on inequality, we had to really stop and unpack for ourselves, what does it mean to do that work well? And for us at Ford, it meant we had to work on issues of power and control. And so if you take just the dominant models that we all live in of philanthropy, right? We have to have a theory of change and we have to have quantifiable outcomes. That couldn't work for what we were trying to do. And it's not to say that we needed to discard that, but we needed a hybrid approach. We needed an approach that put trust and relationships as equal to theories of change and quantifiable outcomes. And at Ford, the grant makers who were the very, very best at that hybrid approach were BIPOC grant makers, our grant makers of color. And they were up against systemic bias in the institution because of the ways in which we undervalued what it meant. And I think philanthropy is deeply suspicious of being overly close to grantees, overly deep in a relationship. And so we had to really stop and really unpack that and begin to try to turn it on its head. And then the second thing that I had to really come to terms with was how we put our money out the door. We at Ford pride ourselves on being a grantee-focused institution. But when we looked at how we were actually making our grants in 2013, most of our grants were one-year grants that were project support, even for organizations that we funded year after year. And so what we were basically saying to our grantees was like, here's a little bit of money for you. We'll tell you how to spend it and come back and ask us for more next year. And that was something that we had to really challenge and interrogate. And as many of you know, we put in place our BUILD program, which, for a number of our grantees provides now multi-year general operating support, 5-year support that can allow grantees to really build a durable infrastructure. And we've moved from making 30% of our grants that way then to over 70% of our grants in that way now. But that's hard work to do. And, the depressing thing, going back to where you started, Edgar, is very few foundations are really changing in that direction. General operating support has gone down, not up. I think that's changing a little bit in COVID, but we'll see. So it really, it's very challenging to try to figure out what is the argument or the evidence that would cause philanthropy to let go of that kind of control and begin to change that behavior. And I think we are not yet. It's hard work to do inside an institution, but we are not nearly advancing as a sector in the ways that we need to do. And until we do that, we will not be resourcing organizations closest to the communities that we care about in the ways that they tell us they need support in order to dismantle structures of oppression. It's just, and it's what you write about, Edgar. It's that it's a highly imperialistic culture, and it's very, very easy when you're on the hot seat to try to produce quote results quickly, to default to old ways and old frames. And so I would say that for me, really learning the hard way what it takes to change those behaviors was a big set of mistakes I made and a big set of learnings that I'm still in.
Yeah, thank you. Nick, what about you?
Nick, you might be muted.
I was going to start just to tag on something Hilary said, which is, what will it take to provide the evidence and convince people of a new way? And I'm just reminded by the Douglas quote that I can't recite properly, which is, power never relents without demand. So we're in the process of working with our board, who started this journey with us. But that question of how do you convince people? How do you use the master's tools to get things done? That's on my mind a lot. So a lot of this conversation comes back to power and privilege and replacement, and who gets to make the decisions for me. And that's part of the edge. I think I've made some efforts and some strides in distributing authority and decision making in our organization. I used to get checked for every decision every time. I'd help people problem solve on things big and small. We're not a giant staff foundation. We've got 20 people. We have a lot of money, but so I exerted myself a lot, and even in distributing that power. I'm a former teacher, I was a commissioner, I've been a CEO for 14 years. So I always have something more important to say than other people, and I still do that. So I interrupt. When I get anxious about something, it looks tough, I talk more, I try to problem solve, I lean in, I'm being helpful, and it's disruptive and disrespectful too often. Still, I'm trying to find my place in those conversations. One of the issues today in my world is, what do I have to offer? Are there things I have? I'm a big believer in liberation work, that people outside of oppressed groups do have things to offer to people inside the experience. Women can help men think about their lives. Men can actually help women think about their lives, et cetera, et cetera. So, figuring out how to find my place, continue to exert myself, and do it in a way that's really consistent with the values I espouse is a work in progress, I'll tell you. One big edge we did that was great in terms of listening to people was early on. We established the community advisory, brought that in to do our strategy with our staff and board. Ended up with a shared presentation of community representatives and staff at a board meeting to really anoint a new strategy. Delia Ariana Weddleton of our staff is responsible for making that work go well with others, but that was a big win. And the other thing I'll say is, in your book, Edgar, you talk about the need to sort of stop and back up a little bit in conversations where you're accounting for yourself. So another mistake was, I'm a smart white person with a lot of power. So when I see something, I just want to go after it. And I could say, Edgar, let's walk together. We're at zero. I think about a number line. Yeah, I see it now. Let's continue walking together toward justice. Well, then my partner might say, Nick, guess what? We've been walking together for years, but every time we've been walking, you've been kicking dirt up on me because you're walking in front of me and you're not paying attention. So I need to back up. So I'm not ready to move forward together. Let's back up to -1 or -2, and let's talk about some of the harms done and just get us together so we can walk forward with integrity. So I would move too fast. I would assume accounting wasn't important. I haven't accounted fully, but I want to get going, and I assume everybody's ready to go with me. But you know what? Maybe I got to stop and clean the dirt off of this person's shoes for a few minutes before we can move forward together. And that's something that your book really brought forward to me, and I'm trying to exercise that in my life. So I'll pause there, and still glad of the work we're doing, but need to keep backing other people and finding the right way to exert the privilege I still have, which is enormous.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And so everyone knows that these are no paid endorsements for my book, but I really appreciate it. And I, and I will say, for those who are maybe newer on your journey, if you're interested, Nick has done a tremendous job of writing on his Medium posts, or that Medium website. I don't know the exact name of it, but follow Nick there. And I've been really inspired by how transparent you've been about your own personal journey. as a human being, but also as a leader in philanthropy there. So thank you for that, Nick.
Thank you.
Yeah, John, love to hear from you.
Thank you. And both Hilary and Nick, thanks for those reflections. I've learned so much from watching both of you and reading what you've said and following along. And I would say also, the most important leaders I think that I have followed have been people of color in the field. So Darren Walker, of course, your colleague Hilary, I think is the undisputed, giant in some ways in our field and been such a mentor to me. Alberto Bargona Knight Foundation, Elizabeth Alexander, Helene Gale in Chicago. I mean, there are such great leaders of color who are doing such inspiring work here. And those have, been my teachers, certainly as I've gotten going in this field. Edgar, as you put the question about edges, I think it's a wonderful way to put it because there are edges everywhere and should be edges everywhere, because I think all of us would agree that the white supremacy culture is pervasive within our field and too much so. We have to change our practices. I think each of you have talked about this in great ways, but I think about every day, how do you deconstruct the systems that have been creating this situation that we don't like, and how do we reconstruct new ones? And I feel like the COVID pandemic plus the racial awakening and reckoning and so forth that's going on and protests, they create opportunity for this kind of small R reconstruction that's a better reconstruction than we've done before. We haven't done it before in good ways. And so there are edges everywhere, I think, in what we do. And I'm about to say some things that are critical of myself and my colleagues at Macarthur Foundation. I don't mean it this way because we have unbelievably wonderful staff doing interesting things. But being introspective, I think we all would agree, 185 people at Macarthur Foundation would agree, we are on a journey. We call it the just imperative. And we see all of the things you've described, Edgar. There is perfectionism in how we prepare our grant briefs. There is too much power lodged within our building and too little with our grantees. There's too little, and the trickier part to me actually is not so much the grantee focus, but how do we actually act in a way that's accountable to the communities that we say we're engaging with and serving, one step beyond the grantees. How do we get that kind of accountability into our decision-making process? And Edgar, if money is medicine and can be medicine, how do we ensure that the way that we are using it, distributing it, which is of course the bread and butter of what we do, is all about this reconstructing a new kind of system. And I think of that as part and parcel of our grant making, for sure. It is part and parcel about how we make internal decisions of all sorts. It is part and parcel of how we do impact investing, and it's how we invest our endowment. And in all of those ways that we use our balance sheets, that we use our power, we need different systems. And if we are not willing to be deeply introspective about our own role in creating the systems that exist and deeply committed to figuring out how to reconstruct them better and in ways that are more empowering to BIPOC communities, to break down white supremacy, to serve the people ultimately that we seek to be engaged with. We are bankrupt if we're not doing that work completely across the board. And so it's early days certainly for us at Macarthur, but we're inspired by the people we are working with and get a chance to be engaged with. I'm grateful for that opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, John. So, I mentioned earlier that there's a window and an opportunity before us. And I personally do feel very hopeful. Like, we're not seeing a lot of progress, but, the verdict is still out and the data is yet to be collected for what's happened in these past couple of years. And so I want to just ask you all what you're feeling hopeful about, and what progress what do you see happening? What are you advocating for to push us forward on this journey? Nick, I'll start with you.
Great. Well, I think I said it's about relationships. This isn't a technical adventure; it's a cultural adventure. It's about our values and how we act as human beings and how we choose to act. So, and I'm careful with this because what I'm about to say is really focused on my colleagues and my friends who identify with me as being white people, white leaders in the audience, and white philanthropy leaders is who I'm speaking of now. And I'll just say that, so on Twitter, there was a reference to this by Rain of April, did a tweet a little while ago. I just want to give a shout out to her for this, where she said, how do you do this when these people, us, haven't done this before, don't have a frame of reference, and haven't consulted with community about what to do about it? So that's the answer for the future. It's about doing it. It's about building a frame of reference, and it's about consulting with community. So, I mean, there's more to it, but that's a good starting point. So I appreciate that. I will say, leadership is an isolating event in our culture today. It's set up to dehumanize us, to keep us separated. I think it has, some ancient militaristic roots because, you can't really be fully human because then you can't do the hard things you need to do that might hurt other people. And that's a lie. All right. You can be fully human and you can be a powerful leader. And I think racism, white supremacy set us up, particularly white leaders, other leaders, to be separated from people so that the harm we do is in the name of the job and we can go home and feel okay about it at the end of the day or on the weekend. And I just think that's not true anymore. So for me and the things I think about moving forward, and these aren't big strategic pieces that I'm starting with, but it's really about, fighting the divide. So I think about my board. So first of all, you cannot do this work without your board. I'm sure there are people who are successful. I could not do this without my board. I couldn't do it without people like Jan Flieger, a white woman who I've known for years who helped us move forward. I couldn't do it today without Greg Gunn, who's our board chair now, who's a fantastic supporter of this work. Deborah Jules Sherman, so many other people on our board who were serious about this. And that was part of the catalyst, right? I had diversified our board. I had a big hand in our board development. And for other reasons not related to this agenda, I had built up a diverse board, which was a good idea to do 10 years ago. And that's all I knew. And that changed the conversation because the patience and tolerance and the perspective of these people was now undeniable because, hey, guess what? We had relationships. I think it's about people like us building relationships with people of color. It can seem a little contrived, but we need to force ourselves to live in different places and to build community, the thing behind me here, with people who are part of our future. And it doesn't take much. My experience has been if you just show a smidgen of hope in terms of your awareness, like people of color give you a big break and a chance at least at navigating toward them. The bar gets higher after that, and that's appropriate. And I think about connecting with white people. This is not the work you do where you go to work tomorrow and you ask your Black colleague, like, what did you make of that panel? Like, start with some white people and talk about this. Get a book club together. Read Edgar's book. Read Waking Up White. We use a workbook at work by Lila Saad. I think I'm saying her name properly. Me and White Supremacy is a huge, not happy workbook to go through, but it's super important. NCRP, Aaron Dorfman and his organization, a Power Moves for Philanthropy, a good guide for moving forward. The other thing is, so then at the organizational side, like trust people and bring people together. I used to think that, every act in our organization was some extension of me. And I'm just grateful that people like Mike Carey and Pam White, Jessica Spahn, and particularly Ghislaine Ngunu, who's been a vice president of programs for 2 years, agreed to come and work with us because she has made a huge difference in our organization and a huge difference in my life. So, and we have a close relationship. It's not all smooth. Many people that I'm close to remind me of the many things I do wrong. And I'm grateful for that most of the time, except when I'm not. And then I would say, then there's succession. Some people who are listening know that I made an announcement that I'm leaving the foundation in a year at the end of 2021. I've been at the foundation for a long time. I'm somewhat older, even though I look youthful and spry. But it was time for me to move on because handing the power of the purse of our foundation should not be in my hands anymore. So I'm happy to do that. I got some mixed feelings about it, but stepping aside is big. There are risks involved with that. I need to keep working. But the risks are nothing compared to maintaining the power structure we have and continuing to exercise the agency and the lift of enormous amounts of capital in a capitalist system for justice. I can help. I'm going to help. I'm going to keep doing it, and maybe I'll lead something else, but it's not going to be this work. And I would say, use your power to lift other people up. If you're thinking about quitting and you're worried about it, call me. It's okay. Life goes on, and it's an important thing to do. And the last piece I'll say is, it's hard work, but it's not always fun, but it's worth it. I'm grateful for this work because it is allowing me to close a gap. In education, we talk about gaps. It allows me to close a gap between the values I espouse and the actions I take. And as a privileged person, that's something I get to worry about. I care about my integrity. I care about my voice. It's imperfect, but I'm working on it. And most importantly, I'd say think about being good ancestors moving forward. I have two young daughters, Dorothy and Jenny. And I want to say something to them about what people do, what white people do to make our world better. And it's not just talking, sometimes it's acting, and it includes sacrifice. And it brings me joy to say that last piece, and you can find joy in this work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nick. Hilary, what progress are you seeing or excited to advocate for to move us forward?
Yeah, thanks, Edgar. I do agree with you. This is a moment. This is a moment. And, one of the things that makes me excited and scared is the amount of money flowing to support racial equity. And, and we have got to disrupt ourselves if that has a chance to be transformational. So what I find really exciting, you think about where disruption starts in fields, and it starts at the edges, as John was talking about edges, is places like Groundswell Fund and the California Black Freedom Fund. There are all these new kinds of intermediaries growing up that are doing the work differently. They are challenging everything about how money gets put out the door. They're centering people of color as their leaders. Their timeline for how they think about how much time it takes to make meaningful change is not in a year or two, but over decades. And they are figuring out participatory grant making. They're figuring out how to get the communities that they serve to be at the table as they make the decisions about grants. Or, experienced movement organizations like the Movement Strategy Center, that as a natural extension of their power building are starting to play that, quote, intermediary function. So what would it look like for big philanthropies and small philanthropies, instead of being lemmings and giving money to big organizations, to say, we're going to get behind these emerging new ways of putting money out the door? It may be too hard for us to do it with everything that we're going to do, but we're going to put money into these collaborative funds, and we're going to make sure they have the resources and the power and the influence to do this work in a different way. And so that is something that makes me enormously excited. It is happening everywhere, and it is poorly resourced. And I think we could do so much better by supporting what those kinds of leaders are trying to do. I think a second thing is for philanthropic organizations to choose for organizations led by people of color in their regular grant making. You cited the statistics starting out, like 10%, less than 10% of all philanthropic resources go to organizations led by people of color. And we have to change that. And we have to understand that oftentimes those organizations want to work differently than we do. Sometimes they don't want to become a formal 501c3. They want to be a leaderful network, rather than a hero-led organization. And we have to work to figure out how to get resources to them, and to understand that that is the kind of work that they are called to do in relationship with their communities. So I feel hopeful at the growth of these new intermediary structures. I feel urgency about the importance of all of our institutions backing organizations led by people of color, and understanding that we have so much more to do than just to give them the check. It is also then our job to make sure their boards and their staff and other funders are supporting them in the work that they are trying to lead, because we still have a whole system of things that can undercut the extra work and burden that those kinds of leaders have to hold. But and I would say that the enormous energy and vision of BIPOC leaders, young leaders, but leaders of all ages and stages who who took to the streets, after the George Floyd murder, and who have fueled the racial reckoning that we have yet to do in this country, gives me enormous hope. And I just hope philanthropy can go into that space and disrupt ourselves and rise to the moment that we're in.
Thank you, Hilary. Yeah, I've been saying a lot lately. We now have in our sector a robust ecosystem of Black and Indigenous and POC-led philanthropic intermediaries. Shout out to Groundswell, shout out to SHOT, shout out to Liberated Capital. And I often say we have the relationship and the trust and the accountability with our communities, but we're lacking the capital. And so I think that's absolutely a significant strategy for redistributing some of this wealth. John, would love to hear from you. What's giving you hope? What are you advocating for to push us forward?
Thanks, Edgar. And I would echo what each of you have said, and maybe lean into Hilary's last point and your point about the particular emergence of more participatory and trust-based philanthropy, and some of the great intermediary funds that are developing. I would shout out particularly to the Democracy Frontlines Fund that Crystal Haling has led at Libra and Tau Rising. That's an example, I think, of a wonderful place where a group of philanthropists have come forward, including family foundations, which I know some people on Twitter have asked us to mention, as well as big historical ones, put $36 million into a pot and handed it to a group of women of color to determine the organizations that should get it, and then have given it to movement-oriented BIPOC-led organizations. So, I think that there are great examples of this that we need to lean into and, do more of ultimately. I'm excited that Macarthur Foundation shifted from being an arts and culture funder to being a culture equity in the arts funder. And now we do not make the decision about who gets the general operating renewals of our grants program, but rather a group of community members do every year. And I sign the checks, yes, but the decision-making rights have been shifted. So I think there are a lot of models like this. I think it's the only model for philanthropy, but I think it's a crucial model in philanthropy. It's about sharing the power, the authority, and in important ways. I would say also, Edgar, I am excited about the emerging change in terms of who leadership is in philanthropy at lots of levels. So the numbers you described are absolutely right, for sure, at a national and international level. I would say there are pockets of real change. I'm excited to be a leader in Chicago, where it's well known, but there are 20 plus people of color leading, the most important foundations in many respects in the city. That is largely women of color. It's more than half Black women, but there are very few actually men of color in those positions. So it's another thing that I saw Derek Johnson tweeted at us about this event, the shortage of Black men in the sector, and that's true in this Chicago bubble I'm describing. But I do think there's change, and I think it is a more BIPOC-led philanthropic community in Chicago, and I would say in some ways majority BIPOC-led in Chicago. I think that's a very, very positive thing. So I think there are demographic changes, and I think there are procedural changes. I think all these things, we've just got to keep pushing at all of them.
Thank you, John. I'm gonna invite my friend Vanessa, but before we jump there, just a quick reminder to our audience, if you're having any problems with Zoom, jump on the YouTube channel at Decolonizing Wealth Project. And also, we're going to keep this conversation going on social media. So just hashtag it at Decolonizing Wealth, hashtag philanthropy so white. Thank you. Vanessa Daniel, my friend, my sister, my colleague at Groundswell Fund. We welcome your reflections on this conversation.
Well, thank you, Edgar. And I just want to appreciate you for a minute and all the ways that you're opening space for authentic conversation in our field. If folks don't already have Edgar's book, Decolonizing Wealth, go get it. It's excellent. I also want to appreciate Hilary, Nick, and John, our speakers today, stepping in front of 6,000 of your colleagues to share your learnings and some of your mistakes about race takes courage. And I think courage is really important. We need a lot more of it in our field. And I think more white folks in our field would be able to access it if they actually broke through two traits of white supremacy, one that Edgar flagged already, which is perfectionism, which really makes people disengage because they're afraid of making a mistake. But the second one I want to lift up is gradualism, which makes people lackadaisical and actually make the same mistake over and over again because of this illusion of endless time to actually start doing the work. And so I think what we're trying to model with this conversation is a third way and a space to really talk about mistakes, talk about the successes too, but also where there's a high expectation of effort and of momentum. And I think we need a lot more of those kind of spaces in philanthropy. I think the first reflection I'd just like to offer on what you all shared is one of hope. I think this work is tough, and the stories you've shared really show that there is a possibility of progress. I think Hilary, the BUILD program and the work you've done with colleagues on that 70% of resources are moving there to long-term funding is huge. Nick, the redistribution of decision-making that you describe, and John, kind of the shifting of grant decisions to community members, these are all really powerful successes. And I think it's important to tell the story of successes and for white people to have examples of how to step up as co-conspirators for racial justice. I think, you know, achieving social justice in this country is going to take a multiracial effort. And I think there's a place for all of us in this work. And it's really important for us to figure out how to get into right relationship. Philanthropy is a really interesting terrain in which to try to get into right relationship, because it, for the most part, reifies everything that's wrong about relationships and power in this country. And so when it's done right, it's interesting to see that it is a space where we can reach across divides of race, class, and gender, and we can stand in solidarity, and we can move from hoarding to sharing, and we can move from dictating to listening. And, you know, I believe that it's possible to do that, not only just because of some of the stories you've heard, but just in my experience running a foundation for over a decade, that is this grand experiment in relationship building, where, you know, we have 500 mostly white donors, 40 mostly white-led foundations that are giving over wealth to a pretty autonomous foundation that's led by a staff and board of women of color and trans people of color, who are distributing those resources to our communities and to organizing in our communities. So it's hard work, but I have seen white people show up in right relationship as board members, as our donors, you know, as program officers. And so I think it's good to keep telling the good news, even as we're doing the hard work. So there's a couple themes in what you all shared that I really want to touch on in terms of how you showed up around racial justice. The first is that you used your power. And Hilary, you talked about the changes you helped push forward. Nick, you talked about backing up colors of colleagues of color, and also sharing your journey, like in your writing on Medium. And also the power that you're using to move on, which I think is really important to talk about. Sometimes there is an importance to move on and actually create space for new leadership. So one thing I want to just say to white colleagues on the call is that people of color, we don't want you to be powerless, okay? Like, we want you to use your power for good. Open doors for people of color, broker introductions, pick up the phone and put in a good word, remove obstacles. As Edgar says, collect your people so that we don't have to. Go into the hard room and fight, the room that we are actually not yet given entry into. As a matter of fact, when you're in that room, take out locks out the doors that shut us out, unrig the game. Like, we need you to step up, and I've seen white folks do this beautifully, to use your power to the fullest to do those things. So pro tip number one on using your power, and Hilary, you talked about this, you talked about learning learning the hard way what it takes, right? That you didn't realize how it takes. Is that most white people are under an illusion about how much work you need to put in to move racial justice. It takes a lot of work, and it's important to build that muscle, to not back off the moment things get hard, but to keep pushing and push through. And then pro tip number two is that the decision to not use your power for good is actually a decision. It's not neutral, it's not indecision. So, you know, the decision in America of the majority of white people to stand by while Black folks have been lynched and shot for 400 years is a decision. You know, the decision in philanthropy to continue to preside over racial disparities in funding that mirror the redlining of Black families seeking home loans in the 1950s is a decision. And it's made every budget, every strategic plan, every docket. It's not passive, it's not weak, it is forceful, it's violent, and no one gets a pass on that. We are all accountable for what we are allowing to happen on our watch. So use your power for good. The second theme that really struck me from your remarks was that you didn't just use your power, you shared it. Now, the single biggest thing that I think white folks in our sector need to understand is this. The cornerstone of white supremacy is the need to dominate and control. So freedom and liberation can never be built from that cornerstone. Not even for white people can it be built from that cornerstone. The only way to freedom for all people is to lay down a new cornerstone for equity and sharing. And many of you touched on this in terms of new models of philanthropy and where decision-making sits. But it's really heretical to talk about this, not only in our sector, but anywhere, because that cornerstone anchors every aspect of American society, right? It's the reason we've got 32 NFL teams and only 2 of them are owned by people of color. And neither of those 2 owners, incidentally, are Black folks, even though it's a league that makes most of its profits off of a player roster that's 70% Black, right? It's the same cornerstone that you know, results in overwhelming white ownership and control of Congress, of television networks, of our schools, of the press, of, you know, and on, and philanthropy, and especially philanthropy, right? Which we know is more white and more male than corporate America. So white colleagues, one simple and clarifying question that you can ask yourselves to know if you're building from a white supremacist cornerstone is this: who has the ultimate decision-making power? And I want to say it again. Who has the ultimate decision-making power? So if you look at your plan for advancing racial equity, and a lot of people are rolling these out very inspired by the uprisings, which is great. We are in a window, as Hilary mentioned. But if you look around at your plan and you notice that you're holding the purse strings and you define success and you decide the priorities and you determine the criteria and you're deciding which people of color are trustworthy and credible, and you have the power to hire and fire, and you can turn the lights on and off on the entire operation, if that's what you notice, then there's nothing fundamentally original or liberatory about what you're doing. You may be moving money to people of color, which is better than not doing that, but you're actually building on the same cornerstone. And so how do we build on a new cornerstone? I think there's a lot of confusion between the actual sharing of power and the performance of sharing of power. And I want to say that there are some Oscar-winning performances of sharing power in our sector by people who are actually relinquishing little to none of it. So let's be clear. Like, we're living in an era where the optics of white millionaires and billionaires deciding where dollars should go for social change is falling out of fashion, even with white liberals and progressives. So there's this aha moment in which there's an opportunity to do something different, right? To actually share, to actually not just give a grant, but to give control of wealth over to people of color to make the decisions. And there's so many ways to do this, right? And Hilary, you touched on a couple of these, right? I mean, there's people of color-led organizations that have the capacity to redistribute. There are people of color-led foundations. You know, we can give to organizations to buy capital and land and to do for-profit exercises that help generate revenue. And then when foundations get serious about making systematic change, we can actually direct not just the 5% that's going to grant making, but the 95% that remains invested, to put that with BIPOC wealth managers like Adesina Social Capital, you know, that actually are walking our values there. So some of the sharing is happening, and that's great. But overwhelmingly, what we're seeing is a lot of white-led foundations recruiting people of color to come work for them as their advisors, their board members, their staffers, and their consultants. So white colleagues, like, if you take nothing else away from what I say, please hear this. Inviting people of color into structures in which we are accountable, not to our own communities, but to white millionaires and billionaires who have the power to hire and fire us, to take our ideas under advisement when they make their decisions, is not actually an invitation into power. It's an invitation to maybe influence or represent, but it's not the same as power. So if anyone is confused on that point, I think what happened at Novo should really disabuse us of that. So it may be in vogue to have grassroots leaders advising, you know, your grant making, but really think about, is that about power for them? Because I would submit that unless these leaders have decision-making authority, unless they're compensated well for their time, and unless there's a big scale of resources, that it's actually a waste of their time. It's more about the appearance of wokeness for the donors than it is about the empowerment of the advisory folks. And it may be in style now for white foundations to replicate within their own institutions what people of color-led organizations or foundations have taken years to develop in terms of programming. But who does that empower? Certainly not people of color. So if people of color have developed a program that you think is great, why not fund them to scale it? Because most of the time, the reason you don't is because you actually don't trust them, and you need to retain ownership and control. You need the cornerstone. So I'm not saying white folks relinquish all power. I'm saying people of color should have equal or more decision-making power over philanthropic dollars. So the last thing I'll say is this, and I want to pass it back to my brother, Edgar. Like, white colleagues, it's so important to free yourself from the lies that white supremacy taught you to keep you afraid and disconnected from your own humanity. So relinquishing dominance is not the same as being marginalized. Listening is not the same as being silenced. And smashing the white supremacist cornerstone of dominance and control will not bring about your destruction. It will actually enable your liberation. So let's all do this, and let's all get free. We can do it. Edgar, back to you.
Go, Vanessa.
Wow, thank you, Vanessa. That was a word for all of us that we need to shout from the mountaintops. So I'm so grateful for that. And, you know, I'm just thinking ahead to the next time we have this conversation. It might be 2023. I really hope that we've gotten beyond, you know, diversity is the floor, right? Like hiring people of color, making more grants to communities of color is the floor, but we've gotten to a place where we're talking about real wealth redistribution, right? Beyond sprinkling grant dollars. And that we're moving from performance to power is really another thing that I'm taking away from your comments, Vanessa. How can we all be powerful? And I love that you said and underscored something that Nick said, that there is joy in this work, and it's all about our collective liberation. There's so much freedom for white people when they step forward and submit to this process on the other side of it. So that's the invitation today. We have to go, unfortunately, and I just want to thank the panelists again today. I thank you, Hilary, Nick, John. Thank you, Vanessa. I want to invite everyone to visit decolonizingwealth.com to subscribe to our newsletter to get updates for all kind of cool things we're doing. We're going to keep pushing this conversation forward around advancing racial justice and healing. We have a fantastic event next week with the Schott Foundation called Justice is the Foundation. We'll be sending out information on social media about that. And we're launching a 2-part series, conversations with funders and movement leaders about reparations next week on February 24th. So you don't want to miss that. Information is on all the socials. Follow us there. Again, much love to everyone. Thank you so much. And I look forward to being in this struggle with you to push us forward. Thank you.
Thank you.